every Tuesday morning for 30 years. 9 o'clock a.m. sharp, Beverly Hills, 1965 to 1995. Dean Martin would walk into Carlo's Barbershop on Rodeo Drive, sit in the same chair, and for exactly 45 minutes, he would talk. Not about movies, not about music, not about the Rat Pack or Frank Sinatra or his latest hit song. He would talk about his failures, his regrets, the people he'd hurt, the son he barely knew, the wives he'd disappointed, the father he couldn't save. Carlo Benedetti, the barber, never wrote anything down, never told anyone what Dean said, not the press, not other customers, not even his own wife. Because Carlo understood something crucial. Dean Martin wasn't coming for a haircut. He was coming for confession. And Carlo's chair was the only place in the world where the king of cool could finally admit he wasn't okay. When Carlo died in 2006 at age 89, he left behind a single cassette tape, recorded on his deathbed. 47 minutes of Carlo finally revealing what Dean Martin whispered in that chair every Tuesday for 3 decades. The tape was given to Dean's daughter, Deanna, in 2007. She listened to it once, then she locked it away for 12 years, until 2019, when she finally decided the world needed to hear it. Not all of it, just enough to understand who Dean Martin really was when nobody was watching. You think you know Dean Martin's story? The autobiography, the interviews, the documentaries. You know the sanitized version. The one Dean wanted you to see. But every Tuesday morning, in Carlo's chair, Dean told the truth. The raw, unfiltered, devastating truth about what it cost to be Dean Martin. This is the story of those Tuesday mornings. The confessions. The tears. The man behind the mask finally admitting that the mask was suffocating him. Carlo's tape reveals something Hollywood never wanted you to know. Dean Martin hated being Dean Martin. He was trapped in a persona he'd created to survive, and by the time he realized it was killing him, it was too late to escape. This is the story of the barber who became Dean's priest. The chair that became a confessional. And the secrets that were finally revealed 11 years after Dean's death. Secrets that change everything we thought we knew about the King of Cool. Let's go back to how this ritual began. 1965. Dean Martin was 47 years old. At the absolute peak of his career, his TV show was the #1 variety program in America. His movies were box office gold. His albums were selling millions. He was rich, famous, beloved, and completely miserable. He'd just gone through his second divorce. His relationship with his children from his first marriage was non-existent. Jerry Lewis hadn't spoken to him in 9 years. His father had died the year before, and Dean had been too busy working to spend time with him in his final months. The guilt was eating him alive, but he couldn't show it. Dean Martin was supposed to be cool, effortless, above it all. So he smiled for the cameras and died a little more inside every day. One Tuesday morning, Dean walked into Carlo's barbershop. He'd been going there for years. Carlo was a fellow Italian immigrant, someone who understood where Dean came from. That day, while Carlo was cutting his hair, Dean did something he'd never done before. He started crying, silently at first, then uncontrollably. Carlo stopped cutting and asked, "Mr. Martin, what's wrong?" Dean shook his head. "I can't do this anymore, Carlo. I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not." Carlo didn't panic, didn't call anyone, just quietly locked the shop door, put up the closed sign, and sat down. "Talk to me," he said. And Dean did. For 2 hours, he talked about his father, about how Gaetano had spent his whole life working in a barbershop, cutting hair for pennies so his son could have a better life. And Dean had gotten that better life, wealth beyond imagination. But he'd been too busy to visit his father, too busy to sit with him, too busy to tell him he loved him. And now Gaetano was dead, and Dean would never get another chance. "I became everything he wanted me to be," Dean said through tears, "but I forgot to be his son. I forgot that all he really wanted was to see me, to know I still remembered where I came from, and I failed him. I had everything, and I still failed the one person who mattered most." Carlo listened without judgment. When Dean finally finished, Carlo said something simple but profound. "Come back next Tuesday, same time. We'll talk again." And Dean did. Every Tuesday for the next 30 years. He'd show up at 9 a.m. Carlo would lock the door, and for 45 minutes Dean would confess, would drop the mask, would finally be honest about the cost of being Dean Martin. On Carlo's deathbed tape, he describes what those sessions were like. Carlo's voice is weak, labored, but clear. Dean would sit in my chair and become someone else, not the cool guy from TV, not the drunk act, just Dino, a scared kid from Steubenville who'd made it to the top and didn't know if it was worth it. He'd talk about his children, about how he'd given them money and houses and cars, but never gave them himself, about how his oldest son Craig had once said, "I know Dean Martin. I don't know my father," and how that sentence haunted Dean for decades. He'd talk about his marriages, about how he'd failed Betty, his first wife, by choosing fame over family, how he'd failed Jean, his second wife, by emotionally checking out after his mother died, how he kept marrying women hoping they'd fill the hole inside him. But the hole was too big. No person could fill it. He'd talk about Jerry Lewis, about how their breakup in 1956 was the right decision professionally, but destroyed him personally, because Jerry had been like a brother, and Dean had walked away without ever really explaining why. And 20 years later, they'd reconciled on TV, but it was for show. They were never truly close again, and Dean blamed himself for that. But the thing Dean talked about most, the thing that consumed him more than anything else, was his belief that he was a fraud, that Dean Martin was a character, not a person. And he'd played that character so long that he'd forgotten who Dino Crocetti was. Carlo's tape includes this devastating quote. "Dean told me once, 'Carlo, I'm the most successful con man in history. I convince the world I'm talented, that I'm cool, that I have it all together. But the truth is, I'm just a dropout from Ohio who can barely read music and got lucky. And every day, I'm terrified someone will figure it out. Someone will realize I'm a fraud, and it'll all disappear.' I told him, 'Dean, you've been performing for 40 years. You've made millions of people happy. That's not a con, that's a gift.' But he wouldn't hear it. He was convinced his success was an accident, that he didn't deserve any of it, that he'd tricked everyone. This belief, this imposter syndrome, shaped Dean's entire life. It's why he worked compulsively, why he couldn't enjoy his success, why he drank, why he isolated himself. Because if you believe you're a fraud, you can never relax. You're always waiting for the other shoe to drop, always convinced that one mistake will expose you." Dean Martin lived for 60 years in constant fear that the world would discover he wasn't actually cool, wasn't actually talented, wasn't actually worthy of the love and admiration people gave him. Carlo's tape reveals another painful truth. Dean used work to avoid dealing with his emotions. He'd take every job offered to him, movies, TV shows, concerts, albums, not because he needed money, but because working meant he didn't have to think, didn't have to feel, didn't have to face the emptiness inside. Carlo recalls, one Tuesday in 1972, Dean told me he'd been offered a residency at the MGM Grand. Huge money, but he was exhausted. His body was breaking down. He hadn't had a real vacation in 15 years. I asked him, "Why don't you say no?" And he looked at me like I'd suggested he jump off a building. He said, "If I stop working, Carlo, I'll have to face myself. I'll have to sit with who I really am, and I don't think I can survive that. That's the addiction nobody talks about. Not alcohol, not pills, but the addiction to being busy, to being needed, to having a reason to get up every morning that isn't just because I want to." Dean was addicted to work because work gave him purpose. Without it, he was just Dino Crocetti. And Dino Crocetti had been rejected, beaten up, told he wasn't good enough his entire childhood. Dean Martin was the armor he wore to protect that scared kid, and taking off the armor meant being vulnerable again. And Dean couldn't do that. The most heartbreaking part of Carlo's tape is when he discusses Dean's relationship with his son, Dean Paul Martin, Dino. Carlo says, "After Dino died in that plane crash in 1987, Dean came to the shop, but he couldn't talk. He just sat in the chair and stared at nothing for an hour. I'd never seen him like that. Empty. After a few weeks, he finally started talking again. And what he said, it broke my heart. He said, 'Carlo, I named my son after myself. I gave him my name. And then I barely knew him. I was always working, always somewhere else. And now he's gone, and I never got to tell him. I never told him I was proud of him. I never told him that he was a better man than I ever was. He was brave. He served his country. He was a good father. Everything I wasn't. And now I can't tell him.'" Dean blamed himself for Dino's death. Not rationally, he knew it was an accident. But emotionally, he felt like if he'd been a better father, if he'd been more present, somehow his son would still be alive. That guilt destroyed him. After 1987, Dean stopped performing, stopped leaving his house, stopped pretending to be okay. He came to my shop every Tuesday until he physically couldn't anymore. And he'd just sit there, not talking, just existing, like he was waiting for permission to die. Carlo's tape ends with this reflection. "People ask me why I never told these stories while Dean was alive, why I kept his secrets. The answer is simple. Dean trusted me. In a world where everyone wanted something from him, his time, his talent, his name, I was the one person who wanted nothing. I was just Carlo the barber. And he was just Dino, a man trying to figure out if his life had been worth it. The things he told me weren't gossip, they were confessions. Sacred confessions from a man who had no one else to talk to. I couldn't betray that. Not for money, not for fame, not for anything. But now Dean's gone, and I'm dying, and I think the world needs to know the truth, not to tear him down, but to understand him, to recognize that the people we put on pedestals are human, that success doesn't protect you from pain, that being famous doesn't mean you're happy. Dean Martin was one of the most beloved entertainers of the 20th century, and he spent his life convinced he was a fraud, convinced he'd failed everyone who mattered, convinced he didn't deserve the love he received. I hope, wherever he is, he finally knows the truth. He was enough. He was always enough. And the people who loved him didn't love Dean Martin, the character. They loved Dino, the real man underneath, flawed and scared and beautiful. When Deanna Martin received Carlo's tape in 2007, she didn't listen to it for 3 weeks. She was terrified of what she'd hear. Finally, on a Sunday evening, she sat in her living room and pressed play. 47 minutes later, she was sobbing. Not because the tape revealed scandals or secrets that would damage her father's reputation, but because it revealed the depth of his suffering, the extent of his self-doubt, the weight he'd carried alone. Deanna said in a 2019 interview, "I thought I knew my father. I knew he was sad after Dino died. I knew he struggled with being vulnerable. But hearing Carlo describe those Tuesday sessions, hearing the things my dad said when he thought no one was listening, it destroyed me, because I could have helped him. We all could have. But he wouldn't let us. He was so determined to be strong, to be the provider, to be Dean Martin. And that determination killed him. He died alone in his house on Christmas morning, 1995, the same day his mother died 35 years earlier. And I think that's what he wanted, to finally stop performing, to finally be with the people he'd lost. My father spent his entire life running from pain. And in the end, the pain caught up. I just wish he'd let us run with him. We would have. We loved him. Not Dean Martin. Dino. We loved Dino." Deanna kept the tape private until 2019, when she decided to include excerpts in a documentary about her father called Dean Martin, King of Cool. The documentary aired on TCM and included about 8 minutes of Carlo's tape. The response was overwhelming. People who'd grown up watching Dean Martin on TV were shocked. "He seemed so happy," one viewer wrote. "I had no idea he was suffering like that." But other viewers, especially men, especially older men, saw themselves in Dean's story. One man wrote, "I'm 72 years old. I've been successful in business. I have a family. From the outside, everything looks great. But I've never told anyone how much I struggle, how much I doubt myself, how terrified I am that I'll fail." Hearing that Dean Martin felt the same way, it helped. It made me feel less alone. That's the power of Carlo's tape. It doesn't diminish Dean Martin. It humanizes him. It reminds us that the people we admire are just people, struggling with the same fears and doubts we all face, and that pretending to be okay doesn't make you strong. It just makes you lonely. The Barbershop on Rodeo Drive, where Dean went every Tuesday, still exists, though it's under new ownership now. The current owner, a man named Giovanni, keeps a small plaque on the wall. This was Carlo Benedetti's chair. Dean Martin sat here every Tuesday for 30 years, not for a haircut, but for honesty. This chair reminds us everyone needs a place where they can drop the mask. Everyone needs someone who'll listen without judgment. Everyone needs permission to not be okay. Giovanni says people come from all over the world to see the chair, to sit in it, to take pictures. Some of them cry. Some of them tell Giovanni their own stories about their struggles, their pain, their secrets. The chair has become a symbol, a reminder that vulnerability isn't weakness, that asking for help isn't failure, that the coolest thing you can do is admit you're not okay. Dean Martin never learned that lesson. He spent his life performing strength, and it destroyed him. But maybe his story can teach us what he never learned. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to admit you're struggling. It's okay to sit in the chair and confess, because the mask you wear to protect yourself eventually becomes a prison, and the only way out is honesty. Dean Martin couldn't find that honesty except in Carlo's chair. Every Tuesday, for 30 years, until he died. So the next time you see Dean Martin on stage, smiling, singing, making it all look effortless, remember Tuesday mornings, Remember Carlo's chair? Remember the man who dropped the mask for 45 minutes a week and admitted the truth? I'm not okay. I've never been okay. And I don't know how to be. That's the real Dean Martin. Not the king of cool, but the man who needed confession, who needed someone to listen, who needed permission to be human. Carlo gave him that, every Tuesday for 30 years. No cameras, no audience, no performance, just Dino and Carlo, a scared man and a patient barber. Talking about life, about regret, about whether any of it was worth it. Dean never found the answer, but he kept showing up, kept confessing, kept trying. And maybe that's all any of us can do. Show up, be honest, admit we're struggling. And hope someone listens without judgment. Carlo listened. For 30 years he listened. And in doing so, he gave Dean Martin the one thing fame couldn't buy: a place to be real. That's the story Carlo's tape tells. That's the legacy of those Tuesday mornings. Not scandal, not gossip, but humanity. Raw, painful, beautiful humanity. The kind Dean Martin hid from the world, but couldn't hide from Carlo, or from himself. Not in that chair, not on Tuesdays, not when the door was locked and the mask finally came off.